Everybody. This is Shravan Balaji,
Hey, and I'm Christian and Saif Madhavan.
and we're here doing this kind of elections podcast dedicated towards examining how previous elections have kind of gone, how they've impacted American democracy, what parallels we can draw to 2016. I think we chose 1968 to start with just because it represents the beginning of the end of the New Deal era. And there are certain key similarities between 1968 and today that we found fairly profound and striking. So, Krishnan, you want to start us off by talking a little bit about what the United States was like at the beginning of 1968?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the 60s in general were a tumultuous time in American history. Obviously, you had everything from the civil rights movement, which really started up in the 50s and was coming to a head in with the Million Man March on Washington, uh, MLK, the more radical elements of Malcolm X, Nation of Islam. So the civil rights movement was one big piece of things. You had Vietnam, which had kind of taken the country by storm, starting with JFK, when he was first elected, going in to support the government of South Vietnam, and then being taken over ultimately by Lyndon B. Johnson, who started to own that war after his own election in 1964. Huge riots, huge opposition to that war amongst the younger elements of the population and amongst more liberal types, but still not the, I would say, killer that it turned out to be later on in the 70s. And then I think from just the period of economic consensus, like you said, Shravan, we were still kind of in that New Deal period of government, not being the problem, but still being viewed as a solution in many ways, in terms of government programs that Lyndon B. Johnson put into place, Medicare, Medicaid, and the idea, generally speaking, that like it could be used to solve people's problems. Johnson was obviously the key figure of this time, the man from Texas, who really single-handedly, in some ways, if you read Robert Caro's Path to Power, series, really single-handedly managed to push through civil rights and the Great Society. But really tumultuous time. All of these social tensions are coming to a head. And the 1968 election proved a lot of them, out.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely very important to take some time to get into like who Lyndon Johnson was, because even if he doesn't run in this election is still a big referendum on not only Johnson, but a lot of things that he did stand for, the Democratic Party that he and his contemporaries built. So Johnson's background is he's basically the son of like a local political official in Texas. And his first job out of college is he's a teacher at a school for, mostly Mexican immigrant children. And the poverty that he saw at that school was so profound that Johnson decided that, he wanted to dedicate his life towards battling those types of causes. Now, Johnson eventually gets elected to Congress in the 1930s as part of the New Deal wave. And, he's this young, very ambitious guy with a huge inferiority complex around everyone around him. And Johnson basically finds out, despite his background as a more liberal, progressive, pro-New Deal congressman, he finds out that the best way that he can actually stay in power is by courting oil and gas, interests at the time. So Johnson, who's more from Central West Texas, goes out to East Texas to where a lot of these, major oil companies are, and talks to these oil barons and says, hey, listen, I'll do what you want, but we're going to need your money. We're going to need your money not only for my campaign, but for the Democratic Party as a whole. And in 1948, when he gets elected to the Senate for the first time, that's kind of his brand. By 1954, just, a mere 6 years later, in a major Democratic wave at the time, Johnson wins his second term as Senate, and he becomes Senate Majority Leader. And here he shifts more to the center, from being a more center-right senator who's the representative of big oil, big gas. And he is someone who does try and work with civil rights leaders. He's notable for kind of shepherding through the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. And he's one of the preeminent politicians at the time. And Johnson in 1960 runs for president, He doesn't really contest in the primary so much as try to use his network of Southern delegates at the convention. And even though he's not successful in beating Jack Kennedy, he still finds his way on the ticket for a couple reasons. So he's picked as vice president both because of the fact he's from Texas, one of the larger states in the Union, and Kennedy really wanted those electoral votes, and also his experience. Even though Jack Kennedy had been in Congress for 14 years, he wasn't really seen as someone who was particularly well-versed in the inner workings of Washington. So one of the key riffs that we'll talk about a little bit later is how LBJ and Robert Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's younger brother, really tend to have major disagreements at this time. And while Robert Kennedy doesn't want LBJ on the ticket, JFK and his campaign eventually come to some sort of agreement, and they give Johnson a role on the ticket. When he's vice president, he actually gets to head up NASA, which is a pretty big deal for a vice president. And he ends up in 1964, after the Kennedy assassination, after passing the Civil Rights Act, winning one of the largest electoral landslides in American history. But by 1968, Johnson is extremely unpopular. And one of the key things that happens is the Democratic primary in 1968 in New Hampshire, where Johnson ends up not losing, but basically underperforming compared to Eugene McCarthy, who is kind of like this firebrand anti-war senator, a favorite among kind of the white upper middle class and young students who were anti-war in the Democratic Party. And Johnson ends up underperforming and famously gives a speech where he says that he will not seek nor would he accept the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. And from there on, 1968 basically becomes an open race for everyone, both the Democratic side and the Republican side.
Exactly. And I mean, I think maybe it makes sense now for us to start talking about the major players in the Democratic and the Republican primaries. I think, given that we've talked about Johnson, maybe we can start out with the Democratic Party and then talk through kind of the Republican Party primary participants. So yeah, like Shravan said, the Democratic primary of the time was totally wide open, and you had basically a few different wings of that party that all were bits and pieces of the New Deal coalition that back when FDR put it together when he was first elected. So I'll talk through kind of the big people, and then we can chat about how all of those different candidates interacted with each other. So I think the first was the preemptive favorite at the beginning of the race, RFK. RFK, was sort of was the brother, first of all, of the sainted martyr, Jack Kennedy, and so was critical from a continuity perspective. He was relatively young. He was known for taking on the mob back when he was Attorney General. He was well respected by African Americans, Latinos, working class Americans. In a way, he was kind of the precursor to the Rainbow Coalition. He held sort of the Rainbow Coalition that came later on in the 80s. And I think it's really hard to overstate the sheer amount of charisma and inspiration that people drew from RFK. He was one of those politicians that people projected their own hopes and dreams onto him, and he reflected them back at people. People saw what they wanted to see in him in a way similar to the way that Obama did. And I think that is really a definition of a once in a generation type of political talent. One anecdote I'll go into before handing it over to Shravan to talk through some of the other candidates is, after Martin Luther King's assassination was announced, RFK, had just landed, I believe, in Indianapolis when that assassination was announced, and had not heard about the assassination until basically he was going up to give a speech to a crowd of largely African American, a largely African American audience. News of the assassination started to spread, and it almost seemed like the riots were happening throughout the country. It seemed like that crowd itself was going to riot. And RFK gave what I believe is considered, one of the finest, frankly, impromptu speeches in American history. and effectively, through just the power of his speech, was able to calm down the audience. And Indianapolis was one of the few major American cities in that time that did not suffer major riots. So that's just to give you a sense of the kind of guy that you were dealing with in RFK.
And one quick thing to add on about RFK before we kind of go on to some of the other candidates is RFK was not always like this. As Krishnan referenced, when he was a lawyer fighting the mob, he was someone who was considered to be willing to do anything in order to win. He was cynical, cold, cruel. He was known well by Congress people as someone who generally had a lot of contempt for some of the processes in D.C. He was young, he was arrogant, he was a hotshot. And after his brother was assassinated, there was this massive character change that he underwent. And that's something that is really being reflected in this presidential campaign. This is a very different man than the guy who was serving as basically, the Michael Cohen to John Kennedy's Donald Trump. He was a fixer for the Kennedy campaign. This guy is someone who is a completely different person, and that can't be understated here. The next person I want to talk about is, Johnson's kind of horse in the race. So Johnson's vice president is this guy named Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Baseball fans might know him as the namesake of the Metrodome, which is where the Twins played. And Humphrey is basically kind of this politician who is the epitome of the New Deal coalition in a lot of ways, and the more liberal members of the New Deal coalition. In 1948, he actually brought out an actor from California by the name of Ronald Reagan to help him get civil rights onto the convention as a plank for the convention agenda. So he's part of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, and his nickname, much like a certain candidate today, was the Happy Warrior. And Humphrey is someone who people generally like. He's affable. He's not necessarily the most brilliant guy, but he's been in Congress for a very long time. He understands Washington, and he has good relationships with the establishment leaders and the political machines that are really dominant in the Democratic Party in the 1960s. And that's something that I think, is very important. So labor unions tend to like him, city politicians, mayors. These people really tend to rally around him because he is the representative of, at the time, what the establishment of the Democratic Party is. Krishnan, you want to talk a little about Eugene McCarthy?
Yes, get clean for Gene. We've clearly done the opposite during this quarantine. You can't see it, but both Shravan and I have grown some pretty gnarly facial hair. But yeah, Gene McCarthy was a senator from Minnesota who really kind of, if I had to draw a parallel to him in the 2020 primary, I would draw it to Elizabeth Warren, I believe. He was the candidate of sort of the liberal intelligentsia, the student protester. Well, maybe that piece isn't as much with Liz Warren, but I guess what you have to consider here is the intensity of the anti-war movement in this country. You had people outside of the White House consistently chanting things like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And so by 1968, in the wake of the Tet Offensive, and frankly, the failure of U.S. policy to achieve any of its goals in Vietnam, and the brutality it was subjecting the Vietnamese people to, and how many Americans were dying over there from the draft, you had the anti-war coalition really come into its own. The burning of draft cards, refusals to actually go into the war, most famously by Muhammad Ali. And that coalition of people, student radicals largely, as well as, liberal elite, needed a candidate. And it found itself a candidate, actually recruited a candidate in Eugene McCarthy, who was a deeply religious man who opposed the Vietnam War on the grounds that, frankly, it was killing too many Americans. And so this anti-Vietnam War movement recruited Eugene McCarthy into the race, where he ran, frankly, on the platform of, getting out of Vietnam. And the coalition that sort of he brought with him was this combination of student protesters who, like they said, were kind of the yippies, the student radicals who viewed Gene McCarthy as someone who was speaking truth to power, and frankly, as the only person who would actually get us out of the war. And then the more upper middle class liberals, the college professors, the high end lawyers, doctors, people who opposed the war on moral grounds, but weren't necessarily, frankly, economic populists in any way. And so Gene McCarthy really entered in as the anti-war candidate, and that's where he kind of found himself.
Yeah, and just to quickly kind of take a snapshot of this moment, we've talked about how this applies to 2020, and the parallels aren't obviously totally equivalent, but I think you can clearly say that in representing the establishment and the political machines of their eras, there is a clear parallel between Humphrey and Joe Biden, both of whom are also the vice president for the previous Democratic president. And their styles and their coalitions tended to be very similar as well. In representing the liberal intelligentsia and being not necessarily one-issue candidates, but focusing on a certain concept of policy that they really wanted to hammer home in American society. With McCarthy, it was the anti-war movement. With Elizabeth Warren, it was anti-corruption. There are certain parallels between those coalitions and the styles of those candidates. McCarthy is a poet and a professor. He was an economics professor before he entered public life, and considered one of the most intellectual members of Congress at the time, much like Warren is today. And RFK and, of course, our candidate, Bernie Sanders, very different backgrounds. One grew up in wealth, one didn't. Very different views on the world originally, but the coalitions that they tried to bring together, working people, ethnic minorities, young people, trying to bring together groups that have either been disadvantaged or ignored previously in American society, which Jesse Jackson does put a name on it, calls it the Rainbow Coalition. Their styles, their messages are very similar. They're running on the platform of, economic populism, a generally left-wing philosophy to governing, and most importantly, they're trying to build this multiracial working class coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And those are where we see in 2020. I think that'd be very helpful.
Hey, Shorm, I'm sorry, you disconnected for a sec. Could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. So effectively just thinking about how we understand the 2020 election in the context of 1968, you see these parallels between
Yes.
candidates.
And I think and I think the one piece of the electorate here of the New Deal coalition that we can say did not necessarily have a candidate in the Democratic primary, and we can talk about that candidate a little bit later on, was the Southern Democrats. The Solid South was, quite frankly, one of the electoral bulwarks of the Democratic Party, effectively up until the Civil Rights Movement succeeded in passing the Civil Rights Act. And white Southern Democrats, I should be very specific here, frankly, did not see any of these candidates as being one of their own. Because the one thing that all of these candidates did have in common was they supported, accepted, and promised to effectively move forward with the civil rights legacy that Lyndon B. Johnson, established through the Civil Rights Act. And so Southern Democrats in this election went to a third-party candidate, Governor Wallace.
And George Wallace, if you guys remember from your A-Push classes or whatever, had arguably one of the most depressing quotes in American history, famously saying, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And while Wallace's history after this election is actually, kind of refreshing, he eventually gets endorsed by the NAACP in a gubernatorial election in the 1970s and does come around on civil rights. In 1968, he's really running to represent the segregationist wing of the party, as well as some of the blue hat white working class voters who are disillusioned with the social liberalism that comes about in this segment of the Democratic Party. And Wallace is appealing to these people not only through his rhetoric on race, but also by picking Air Force Colonel Curtis LeMay, who is probably one of the more egregious war criminals in American history.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, on par with. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know who to compare him to. This is the man that was the biggest proponent for the firebombing of Japan, which murdered hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians because Japanese cities are largely made of wood. So when you firebomb them, the entire freaking city burns down. Uh, he became famous, and we'll talk more about the campaign a little later on, but he became famous in this campaign for stating that Americans were too worried about the effects of nuclear war and that it wouldn't be that bad in the future. So in many ways, we'll set this aside for right now, but George Wallace kind of shot himself in the foot by picking this crazy guy. But in a way, he was reflecting another part of his base, which was the kooks, as Nixon put them, the birchers, the real crazy types who hated every minority under the sun, thought communists were living under their bed. But, two pieces of a coalition, the crazies and, white working class folks. But we'll get more into that piece in the election.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to say about the Democratic Party is that, the New Deal coalition was built around consensus on economic populism and building a more equitable society in terms of structuring the economy, in terms of supporting unions, in terms of supporting kind of working class people, farmers, et cetera, immigrants, like that. But there was no consensus on race, even though it did seem that a large segment of minorities would shift to the Democratic Party by the 1964 election. And there was absolutely no consensus on foreign policy. The American kind of mantra at this time, as stated by longtime Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, another Texan, is basically that all politics stops at water's edge. And what that means is, you can argue about how to deal with economics or like social issues or legal issues at home, but you listen to the Pentagon, you listen to the military industrial complex as soon as you get to foreign policy. And now there's an element of the Democratic Party that's saying, no, we're not going to do that. And they're not isolationists. These aren't people who believe the United States shouldn't help other countries in the world. They believe in international cooperation. They're just people who don't support the use of lethal force halfway across the world for a conflict that pretty much, a lot of people this time didn't think we had any business being involved with. And that's really a big reason for the rift in the Democratic Party. It's not just civil rights. It's not just the fact that you have these like groups that can't generally working together, but the entire consensus on foreign policy is completely blown open.
Yes. So, yeah, I think that's exactly right. Maybe we should hop on over to the Republicans, everyone's favorite, the good old-fashioned GOP, and maybe talk about the 3 R's of the Republican primary of '68.
Yeah, Richard, Ronald, and Rockefeller. I guess you could go Reagan as well, Reagan or Ronald.
Yeah, double R. That's why ultimately he became, the standard bearer. 2 R's in his name. What more can you ask for, honestly?
Exactly. Do you want to start with who Richard Nixon is?
Oh yeah, Tricky Dick. Well, okay. I don't know if anyone here's seen Mad Men, but there's a scene in the first episode of Mad Men, which takes place, I believe, in the lead up to sort of the 1960 election, where they're describing there's an opportunity to work for a presidential campaign in 1960, and it's about this handsome Navy veteran who is running for office on a platform of hope and change. And hey, do you want to work for him? And they go, not for Nixon, not right now. And honestly, I think this is something that gets lost, is that Nixon and Kennedy in 1960 was seen as sort of the election of two young men against each other. But to back up the story a little bit, Richard Milhouse Nixon was a Californian who grew up actually quite poor. I believe his dad was like a grocer to some extent. And he served his country quite well with distinction in World War II in the Pacific, came into the House, and ultimately was Eisenhower's vice president, was made Eisenhower's vice president, and was sort of seen as the future of the party. I think in the 1960 election specifically, he really ran as somebody who accepted to some extent the New Deal consensus in the country. This was the time where Republicans, frankly, were pro-union. Everyone was pro-union. Everyone believed unions were, the path to American prosperity, and that American government should work for, the middle class and the working class. The 1960 election is probably also one of the greatest rat fucks of all time. Nixon ran against Kennedy, and quite frankly, that election, you could make a very strong argument that it was stolen from Nixon. Illinois, in particular, had a significant number of, let's say, the recently deceased voting on its rolls. And some say that the Kennedys' associations with organized crime ultimately were enabled him to win in 60. And basically, after that election, Nixon told himself, I will never get out dirty tricked again in terms of winning electoral office. So, you go through the 60s, Nixon kind of goes back into the wilderness to lick his wounds, but comes back and realizes that 64 is a lost cause. I don't believe he even ran in 64. No. And ultimately comes back in 68 and is, quite frankly, the party favorite for the nomination. But once again, have to say, he is running in the middle of the party. But to define the middle of the party, maybe we go to the extremes of the party. So I don't know, Shravan, if you want to talk about, Ronnie.
Oh, definitely. And one quick thing to add about Nixon is Nixon was funded for his Senate campaign in 1950 by none other than Joseph Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, and he's this kind of anti-communist, crusader. And when he gets picked by Dwight Eisenhower to be VP in 1952, Eisenhower doesn't like the guy at all. And Eisenhower never really was a huge fan of Richard Nixon as the person, but he did want the electoral votes of California. So Nixon is someone who gets this opportunity and does become really the first modern vice president. Not only is he active and he's doing things, but he's traveling to foreign countries and having debates with the Soviets, right? Nixon is this pretty dynamic, charismatic figure. And he's someone who I think a lot of people don't fully understand. And we'll talk more about that later. But I think in particular, Nixon in 1960, Nixon and Kennedy, there's no real polarization between these guys. They pretty much stand for the same things. You're really picking a person. You're not really necessarily picking between two different people. In fact, a lot of civil rights leaders thought Nixon, not Kennedy, would be the better candidate for their cause. MLK's father, for example, was a longtime Republican. Jackie Robinson, one of my favorite figures of the 20th century, was someone who donated money to Richard Nixon's campaign. So just things to consider about him.
Yes.
All right, Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan is, in my opinion, probably the political figure whose legacy we still have to deal with the most in American politics today. And Reagan's background is like Nixon. He grows up fairly poor. He's from Illinois, and he gets his first job is as a broadcaster for baseball games. And while Reagan isn't necessarily the most intellectual guy, Reagan is someone who's extremely charismatic, great looks, great voice, makes his way through Hollywood, and he's kind of a fairly well-known B-list actor at the time. In the 1950s, he's the host of General Electric's Sunday night show, which was a thing back then that I don't fully comprehend because back then my ancestors were in India.
Yeah, same.
But Reagan is this guy who's been around American public life. And as mentioned earlier, in 1948, he's a liberal Democrat. He's speaking out in favor of all the actors who were getting kind of, crusaded on by the House and Un-American Activities Committee, by people like Richard Nixon at the time. So Reagan eventually, once he starts making his money in Hollywood, realizes he's paying 90% in income tax and says, wait, why the hell am I a Democrat? And like many Californians at the time, especially in Southern California, he really starts to get interested in, more conservative, free market oriented politics. And this isn't just economic conservatism like the Robert Tafts of previous days. It's kind of this three-legged stool of conservatism, which is, muscular foreign policy, economic conservatism, and, kind of laissez-faire corporate market orthodoxy, and social conservatism. And one of the things that Reagan really rediscovers at this time is his faith, in part due to his marriage to Nancy Reagan, who would later, of course, become First Lady. So Reagan is someone, in 1966, he gets elected governor of California, and he's been a Republican effectively for about a couple years now. In 1964, he gave a famous speech for Barry Goldwater. And even though Goldwater got absolutely clobbered in the election, Reagan became a rising star within the Republican Party. And in 66, he gets elected governor of California. And by 68, he's a national figure. And a lot of people thought that Reagan was someone who had a good shot of getting to the presidency. He's a little bit older, obviously, but he's very good looking, brilliant speaker. His nickname, of course, is the Great Communicator. And he's someone who I think can really speak to average Americans in a unique way. I think if we talk about 1980, we'll have to get into the comparisons between him and Trump, because the media did say a lot of the same things about both of them. But in 1968, he's this pretty young kind of revolutionary figure in the Republican Party who's representative of its more conservative orthodox wings.
Yep. All right. And then the last sort of major primary participant, let's say, in the Republican primary was Nelson Rockefeller, who was grandson, I want to say, of John D. Rockefeller, noted American oligarch. And I think what's interesting at this point is, Nelson Rockefeller, just to provide some of the background, obviously son of one of the wealthiest families in America, actually, I believe, served under the Democratic administrations of FDR and Truman in governmental posts, but ultimately was a Republican. And finally, I think, and most famously, he served as governor of the state of New York. And what he represented was, what are now known as the Rockefeller Republicans, which is to say the quote-unquote liberal wing of the Republican Party. Liberal, not so much, to some extent, I guess, on economic policy, insofar as everyone was sort of shifted to the left by the New Deal consensus, but frankly more liberal on things like civil rights. This was the natural home of what you would call the Eastern establishment. Folks like names like you might remember from, your U.S. history classes, like Henry Cabot Lodge III, people who had names like that. These were the extremely wealthy, extremely well-bred, Republicans, frankly. And Nelson Rockefeller and this grouping of, Eastern liberals who were in the Republican Party, at this point, I would say, and Shravan, correct me if I'm wrong here, they were kind of a spent force in the Republican Party. And the reason that they were a spent force is because Rockefeller ran in 1964 for the Republican primary against one Barry Goldwater. And ultimately, this was a Republican primary that pitted the liberal Republican Party, which is led by Rockefeller, versus the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party, which was the hard right, socially, not as much, but conservative wing of the Republican Party. And in this brutal primary, frankly, Goldwater comes out on top, and the Eastern establishment, to some extent, is defeated. Now, what kind of motivates Rockefeller to run in 1968 isn't really known. He didn't really run a campaign, frankly, but he was wishy-washy, was going back and forth between whether he was going to run or not. Ultimately, lets himself up to be nominated, and I think his goal was really to kind of scoop up undecided voters and those who thought, maybe that the Republican Party was going too extreme. But that was sort of the third, let's say, pillar of the Republican Party, although by far the weakest and the one that was, going away the fastest.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think we've spent half an hour talking about people, which is definitely more interesting in the context of 1968 than it would be in, say, 1992. But I think now we should probably turn gears to the primaries themselves.
Yes.
And one quick note before we get into that is that the modern primary isn't really a thing in 1968. Yeah, you have some states that vote, but most states really just end up sending delegates to the convention and some sort of backroom deal is worked out. So it happened in 1960. And in 1968, the primaries obviously matter a little bit more, but there's still a good chance that something can happen at the convention. Someone can storm to the nomination from there. And the mantra for the Republican Party at the time, per Theodore White, who famously wrote The Making of a President in 1960, was the conservatives would dominate rhetoric for 3.5 years. And then the moderates would come in July and take the day. They'd win the nomination. They'd put up Dwight Eisenhower. They would put up Richard Nixon, who was considered more moderate in 1960, etc. And in 1964, that started to change. So we're really seeing the shift in American politics. I guess to keep our order, Christian, you want to start by talking about how the Democratic primary process went and through the convention?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Shravan talked about this initially, but actually LBJ was initially there in the Democratic primary process, and it was his less than satisfactory win in New Hampshire that led him to drop out. And then when that happened, basically it blew the field wide open. And what you had was effectively, to some extent, Hubert Humphrey, who we mentioned, actually did not run in any of these primaries. And spoiler alert, he becomes the nominee. So just to give you a sense of how undemocratic these things were, he was just kind of hanging out, as someone running for president. So what you really had was a race in the primaries themselves between Gene McCarthy, who was the earliest candidate, I believe, to announce, and then also the most organized. So he was actually winning primaries versus RFK. And RFK was still getting organized, in his primary campaign. But ultimately, one of the big turning points in the campaign is that RFK is going hard, is having a debate against McCarthy, appears to be getting a lot of momentum. And then he wins the all-important California primary, which is an incredible feat. It basically puts him in some ways on the path to nomination. But then in one of the all-time, I'd say, what ifs and all-time tragedies of American politics, he is assassinated right immediately after winning the California primary by a man named Sirhan Sirhan in the kitchen of I forget what the hotel was, but a hotel. That's right. In the kitchen of this hotel immediately after winning the primary. And what that does is an already open primary loses its front runner. And effectively now the race is between Gene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey. One thing I do want to point out is that Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary justified her staying in the race after it became mathematically impossible for her to win by saying that, hey, RFK got assassinated. So just one thing to lay out there, another parallel between 2008 and the present.
Yeah, and speaking of the friends of Jeffrey Epstein, I think it's worthy to note here that Sirhan Sirhan, there were a lot of conspiracies surrounding the assassination. He's made some contradictory statements over the years while he's been in prison. And one of the things he stated is that he doesn't remember the events of that day. He doesn't remember actually pulling the trigger. And, there are other podcasts and people who want to talk. But it's worth noting that the stuff that
Google MK Ultra.
Google MK Ultra. But the stuff that RFK was proposing was very radical at the time. And there were a lot of people in positions of power who may not have wanted to see him succeed and may have wanted him to go the same way as his brother.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I think, the primaries, I think there were maybe 7 primaries that ultimately happened. So they, frankly, at the end of the day, what ended up mattering the most, though, was the convention. The Democratic National Convention of 1968, one of the all-time most famous conventions, I would say, in American political history. This convention takes place in Chicago. And Shravan, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Chicago in the 60s and one Daley.
Yeah, so the term Chirac is often thrown around with some probably problematic connotations. But if you want to compare Richard Daley to someone, it's probably Saddam Hussein in terms of just the sheer brutality with which he dominated the city. He was elected mayor in 1955. He served until 1976. And he was really representative of a lot of the traditional democratic political machines that dominated Northern American politics for much of their first half and throughout, the second half of the 20th century. His coalition was, working class white people, immigrants, and his favorite tool was corruption. He would control the board of kind of election supervisors in Chicago, and nothing happened that he didn't want to happen. No one got elected who he didn't want elected within the boundaries of the city of Chicago. Not only did he control Chicago, but every congressman from Chicago, which at this time is the second most populous American city, is basically a pawn of Mayor Daley. So Daley's got the city with an iron fist. And the convention comes about in 1968 where you see all these coalitions colliding, right? You see civil rights protesters, anti-war protesters. You see the police who in this time are by and large a key part of the Democratic coalition, especially in a city like Chicago. And you see these groups and they're all fighting with each other. It is complete chaos. They can't actually hold the convention together. It's in a complete mess. And Daley basically ends up sending his police to kind of provide a beat down of the protesters.
Mm-hmm.
And it just
all on TV, all on live TV. They're shooting tear gas basically at the protesters. There's a story that the tear gas actually went into the hotel where they were having the convention and into the suites of the delegates who were there. And it is just a total disaster for the Democratic Party from an optics perspective.
Right. And I remember in 2008 reading an article about how Chicago at this time in Grant Park, which is where a lot of the protests were happening, there's a parallel between the death of American liberalism in 1968 and how some people were optimistic enough in 2008 to see it being reborn in Grant Park after Barack Obama won. But you see this entire coalition fracture, not only in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense as protesters are getting their bones broken. At the order of the Democratic mayor of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things from American politics that kind of were shelved or weren't really public knowledge throughout much of the first half of the 20th century. But just like with Vietnam, live TV changes how people see the convention. And you're seeing the party that's basically run America for the last 40 years disintegrate in front of your eyes while you're sitting at home watching this on TV. So it's certainly a sight to behold.
Yeah, absolutely. The actual primary, the actual convention, like the actual nominating process in and of itself is actually pretty anticlimactic. Basically, after RFK's death, the majority of delegates go to Hubert Humphrey, basically as the establishment candidate. There's very little small d Democratic input into the primary process. He wins the primary. He is made the Democratic nominee, and he selects, I believe, Ed Muskie of Maine as his vice president. Who we won't talk much about him, but basically the bottom line is Humphrey wins. He is totally marred by these anti-war protests, and that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the general election. So maybe we go on to the Republican primary process and the nomination there.
Yeah, so there's really no reason to spend a ton of time with the Republican process because it was pretty straightforward. One thing to note is a variety of different candidates did win primary contests, including Reagan, Rockefeller, Richard Nixon. But convention happens in Miami. And this Miami in 1968 is very different from Miami in 1972 for the Democrats. And Richard Nixon walks out of there with the nomination. And Reagan and Rockefeller originally kind of envisioned some sort of coalition to stop Nixon from getting the nomination. But you're talking about two people who are from the ideological extremes of the party. And naturally, they're not really able to get anything solved. So Nixon walks away with the nomination. He's got, the Republican Party, which just 4 years ago received an absolute thrashing at the hands of Lyndon Johnson. They're coming into this general election pumped and ready to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So now I think we should get into the general election. And one thing to remember, I think, here is that this is all happening in the context of just conflagration in U.S. cities. MLK was assassinated in April of '68, and there have been they're called riots, in the common American political terminology, but realistically, these were urban uprisings against the city governments of these places. In fact, there's in the '68 Washington, D.C. riots, rioters came within, I think, four, maybe 5 blocks of the White House and burnt down huge swaths of the city. This was not minor. So, and like Shravan said, this is all playing out on live TV. People are getting live images of this, live video broadcast into their homes. And so the whole general election campaign takes place in the context of these mass upheavals in American society. And that really sets the tone for what the different candidates ultimately end up talking about.
Absolutely. Do you want to kind of get into how Richard Nixon and, of course, arguably the most conservative New Yorker ever from north of 125th Street, end up kind of, let's say, sabotage. It's probably the most polite way you can really say it. Our process in terms of peace talks with Vietnam.
Yeah, that's the second piece of this. Is obviously the Vietnam War is strongly underway as well here, and plays a massive role in what's going to happen going forward. And so this is a truly fascinating story. And it wasn't well known at all, really, until when? When did it actually come out? I don't even know when the story actually came out, but it was until significantly later. But basically, what happened was there were peace talks, underway more or less between the U.S. government and the government of North Vietnam, led by Le Duan, and Ho Chi Minh was kind of the figurehead at the time. And the goal here was to agree to basically a relatively complex formula that the Johnson administration was working on with the North Vietnamese government that would basically allow for a bombing halt in Vietnam in exchange for the North Vietnamese and the NLF, the National Liberation Front, sometimes known as the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, to basically come to a unofficial, let's say, ceasefire, or at least a diminution of violence. In a lot of ways, it has parallels to what the Trump administration has been doing in Afghanistan with the Taliban, where it's not, a peace per se, but it's a reduction of violence. And these are all, were intended as confidence-building measures to ultimately lead to a true ceasefire and a political settlement to the problem. Basically, what happens is Nixon and his buddy, Kissinger, and I don't think we need to get deeply into Kissinger here, but right now. But they work with some Chinese origin woman named Shino, who has her own, connections to the triads, as well as Chiang Kai-shek, who has connections with the southern Vietnamese government. And basically, what they do is some unofficial backdoor diplomacy to tell the southern Vietnamese government of the time, hey, if you pull out of these peace talks that the Americans are holding with the North Vietnamese, we will basically be able to strongly support you going forward. And if we are elected president, and if we are able to come to power. because one thing you have to remember here is the Southern Vietnamese government was deeply unpopular with the Southern Vietnamese population. It was widely seen, and rightfully so, as corrupt, a puppet state of the Americans, and basically only interested in creating wealth for the tiny Catholic, French-speaking upper-class minority of the country. And so what they effectively do is sabotage the peace talks by getting the Southern Vietnamese government to publicly, denounce them and saying that they will not be part of it, collapsing the entire peace process in Vietnam, leading to an escalation of the war, and further, frankly, in a kind of brilliant political masterstroke, totally undermining the Johnson-Humphrey narrative on the war in the middle of the election. Other fun fact here, LBJ knew that this was happening and that Nixon was talking to the Southern Vietnamese government, viewed it as basically treason, but did nothing to actually stop it because he wanted there to be, the sort of united American front against, in foreign policy. I wonder what would have happened, and Shravan, if you want to weigh in here, I wonder what would have happened if, there had been some public disclosure about this backdoor diplomacy that was happening.
Yeah, there's a part of me that probably would hint that Johnson's got this very much kind of devotion to the Pentagon and to the military-industrial complex at the time, whereas with Kennedy, you had this kind of Harvard-educated skeptic who had a superiority complex. Johnson is this deeply insecure figure who hates kind of the intellectuals in his party, but does have admiration for the military. And I imagine that there was probably some deference going on there at the time, that he probably didn't want to cross any of the generals, many of whom likely supported what Nixon was doing, particularly the likes of people like William Westmoreland, who was one of the
another war criminal,
one of the major American generals in Vietnam at the time. But publicly, Nixon is saying he's going to end the war. Nixon is running on partially ending the war in Vietnam. He's saying we're going to fight communism and we can end the war. And people believe him because nobody thinks Richard Nixon is soft on communism, right? The phrase that only Nixon could go to China really starts with him going to Vietnam here.
Yeah.
No one really thinks that Richard Nixon is soft on communism. So he's got some more flexibility on these issues compared to some other people. And then you kind of get into Humphrey and Johnson, and Humphrey's in a very tough position. Obviously, he can't publicly oppose the war because he's vice president. Like it's a pretty tough position.
It's a no-no. Yeah.
But Humphrey also, isn't someone who necessarily believes in the, full might and force use of military power that the Johnson administration is putting out there. Humphrey's a good soldier. He's someone who sticks by the administration. And by the end of the election campaign in late October, Johnson actually gives him permission to oppose the Vietnam War. And the numbers actually close dramatically for Humphrey. And as we head into November here, we're seeing this kind of narrowing of the polls. Nixon's been leading the whole time, but Humphrey might actually win this thing. Some people think at the time. And
it's very, very close.
Yeah, and you get into the actual election, right? And I off the top of my head, I think the popular vote margin was within like 1% to 2%.
Yep.
And the electoral map is pretty clear cut for Nixon, but kind of similar to 1960, you have a very close popular vote. You have a pretty clear electoral vote, but a lot of states are won fairly thinly, including Nixon's home state of California here. You flip a couple states in the direction of Humphrey, and he wins this election.
Yeah, and even more scarily, you flip a couple states to Wallace, and it goes to a deadlock where nobody wins an electoral college vote, and it goes to the stupidest system. We have a lot of stupid political systems in America, but I think our stupidest political system is probably the way in which we decide who wins the presidential race if no one wins a majority of the electoral vote, which is that it gets voted on so first of all, it's separate. So the House votes for the president and the Senate votes for the vice president. So 1. 2, sorry, I'm getting into a pet peeve of mine here, but 2, in the House, it's based on state delegation votes. that's who determines who wins the presidency, not actually the members of the House of Representatives. So that's a separate piece. But I think maybe the one other thing we should talk about in the general election dynamic is what happened to Wallace and Wallace's piece in this campaign. Because he was on all 50. I think there's a perception of Wallace as someone who is a son of the South. And ultimately, he did win all of his electoral votes in southern states.
Yep.
But he was also running as a nationwide candidate on the American Independence Party platform. And what that means is he was going to the cities in the north, where he was never going to win the states, and he was having massive rallies there. He wasn't, the rallies were not white supremacy or segregation now, segregation forever, but they were a more sharp-edged version of the speeches that Nixon was giving on law and order. Wallace spoke, I think famously, he said, "I'm not in favor of a police state in this country, but sometimes the police have to have control in the state." So these were the kind of speeches that he was giving on the 68 campaign trail, and they were wildly successful. I think this is honestly a very strong parallel with Donald Trump. He was filling Madison Square Garden in New York City with the white working class in a way that, frankly, even Trump wasn't able to do. Trump was filling his rallies with upper middle class, car dealership owners who live in the suburbs. But Wallace really did have a hold on the imagination of organized labor during this time period. And I think at one point in the polls, and take them how you will, he was up at around 30% of the popular vote. Now that percentage went sharply down. I think he ended up with like 10 or 11% of the popular vote in the election. And there were a few reasons for that. One is that, third parties in the US commonly suffer the issue that no one actually thinks they can win. And so, as you get closer to an election, they go down in popular vote shares. People, sort themselves into the two major parties. But I think the second piece that I would like to talk about, because I think it is really alien to folks living today, is that organized labor was kind of at the height of its political muscle at this point. And they ran a incredibly well-organized and effective campaign in union halls around the country to convince people that, hey, George Wallace is no friend of labor. And what they did to actually succeed in this was they pointed to Alabama and how labor was treated, frankly, in Alabama. Unionization was effectively illegal, and there were no organized unions there. And they said basically, hey, here's what the rest of the country is going to look like if you vote for this guy. And that sharply reduced his share of the union vote in the lead up to the actual election itself. Much of that went back to Humphrey, which is what led to his kind of late surge that made the election feel very close.
Yeah, I think George Wallace, even today, still captures some of the imagination of the so-called alt-right or some of the more traditional conservatives on the American kind of political spectrum. Maybe not for his rhetoric on race, although I do think that even if they'll never admit it, that's part of it, but particularly law and order. His depiction of law and order redefines American politics for the next 40 years. Yeah. Really until 2016, you don't really have a strong questioning of the traditional practices in American policing. And you got to give a lot of that credit to groups like Black Lives Matter and the people who came after people like Hillary and Bernie and Joe Biden for their support of the 94 crime bill. And that's something that really gets lost. The whole Kamala is a cop discussion that we see in 2020 would have been completely alien like 10 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. And it's something that has taken Americans a very long time to change their minds on. Even in the 1980s and 90s, you had Democrats running as being tough on crime. That was very important to people because no one wanted to be associated as like a New York or California liberal who was just la-di-da about the dangers and safety of crime.
Go ahead. I was going to say the only other thing that I would add in terms of Wallace's lasting legacy on American politics was a strong and successful anti-cosmopolitan elite bent to his politics, because the foil in his speeches was not just obviously, the communists abroad and the hippies at home or whatever, but the college professors, the intellectuals, those who fancied themselves, more liberal than the liberals and sort of let's say, the moral soul of this country. And he ran against them. I think he had the famous quote, college professors want to tell us how to run this country, but they can't even park a bicycle straight, and things like this, running against sort of the namby-pamby liberal elite has become really a mainstay of Republican success in electoral politics. And I think we discount at our own peril just how effective kind of the libidinal investment people have in not being, one of those liberal elites is. And so that was the other sort of enduring success, I would say, of the Wallace campaign.
And one thing that, just to go off of that, is that running against cosmopolitan elites hasn't really been a successful metric in American politics until this time. The Democratic Party is run by the likes of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. These very wealthy liberals who tend to have significant control over the Democratic Party, who captured the imaginations of working class people. Even if you go back in American history, there has been a lot of faith and trust that has been placed into the so-called American aristocracy, and maybe not the first generation, but in particular the kids who ended up deciding they wanted to do something good with their life and entered public service, as Jack Kennedy did, as Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt did. So that's something that's significant as well. The kind of faith that Americans have in their institutions extended to their elites at this time, in large because their elites did preach kind of more popular values. And Wallace really puts that on its head.
Yep.
So we touched on the election and the outcome, and Nixon obviously wins. And it's still 1968. The Democrats still control the House and the Senate. So it's not like Nixon is going to be able to enact the agenda of the John Birch Society at this time. But Krishnan, do you want to talk a little bit about how this kind of readjusted the mindset of American politicos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously the Goldwater campaign of 64 was the first one in which the Republicans had actually made inroads into the South. And I think the 68 campaign basically, there's the famous phrase, the Southern strategy, where the Republicans went after white people in the South on a platform of law and order and dog whistling, but not that, softly, about the need to slow down the civil rights movement, slow down reforms to desegregation, and restore quote unquote order. And in this election, I'm staring at the map right now. Nixon wins South Carolina. Nixon wins North Carolina. Nixon wins Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida. Realistically, the only places that he loses in the South are to Wallace, who wins the quote unquote deep South of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And so you start to see the realignment of American politics as the South goes from, the solid South of the Democratic Party to a stronghold of the Republican Party. And it's kind of interesting because looking at this map, I think that if you showed someone this map today, they would be totally unable to recognize what the hell was happening. The Democrats won West Virginia and Texas, but lost California. The Republicans, like I said, win New Jersey and Vermont, but lose Texas. So it's this weird time where we're seeing the old party system of the New Deal and the Reagan Republican Revolution kind of switch places. And there's a lot of wacky political outcomes that come out of it. But I think the big thing is the Democrats no longer can win the South, automatically count on the South to win elections.
Yeah, and I guess kind of on a conclusion point here, we've talked about the people, we've talked about some of the events, we've talked about how the map looked. 1968 is not just a tumultuous year in American politics. It's a tumultuous year across the world. You've probably heard of the Olympics that were held in Mexico City, marked by student protests.
A massacre.
Yeah. You saw that, generally speaking, across the world, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe at the time with the Prague Spring. Like there was a lot of political movement going on, and not necessarily in the same direction. So when Nixon takes office on January 20th, 1969, what's the take on the world? What are people thinking?
Yeah, I mean, like the other place you mentioned Europe in '68, I think the other thing to consider is that France in '68, kind of one of the main pillars of the Western establishment, the Western capitalist establishment, almost underwent a revolution. The May '68 movement in Paris basically shut down the city. Student protesters and blue collar workers went on strike and almost forced out de Gaulle from government. And so I think, Nixon is coming to power on this platform of law and order, and is in a way going right. The United States, like it often does, is going right when a lot of the world is going left. And so I think he is viewed as sort of this conservative figure that there's almost like a wait and see, what's actually going to happen here. Clearly, America is incredibly divided over this issue of Vietnam. What is Nixon going to be able to do to win? And, is he going to be able to convert this? Okay, he had a strong electoral college majority, but a very, very weak, popular vote majority. Is he going to be able to convert this into a real governing coalition? Or is the tumultuousness of the riots of '68, of the assassinations, of the war, going to continue and shake apart, the United States?
Yeah. And, whoever ends up taking office in January 20th, 2021 is likely going to be in a similar position in terms of just massive global uncertainty. And Nixon has got some barriers, right? The state bureaucracy is still pretty much the same. Nixon hasn't completely gone into that yet. And I think on surface, for a lot of liberals who looked for Republicans they can admire, Nixon is this guy who ends up coming off as like this last New Deal president. One of the common citations I see is that Nixon passes the Clean Water Act. He, immortalizes the EPA. He puts that into law. But Nixon also gets into a lot of very different things. And there's a lot of great books and materials you can check out regarding Nixon and Kissinger and just the sheer amount of criminal activity and immoral just debauchery that happened in the Nixon administration. But this is a guy who is very good at playing lots of different angles. He's called Trade Dick for a reason. And that's something that I think we will talk more about in our next episode, where we look at the 1972 election, which, despite the electoral map, is a lot more interesting than it looks.
Yep. I'm afraid and I'm loathing it, but I'm ready to do it.
All right. Thank you guys so much for listening. Really appreciate it. Leave us any feedback or comments, and we love to talk about elections. We love to talk about history. Let us know what you think, and if there's any points you want us to hit on, we're happy to do that.
Yeah, and if you're interested in joining us on this for an election that you like or have an interesting take on, hey, let us know.
All right.
All right.
So much.
Till next time.